A celebrated millionaire dared a janitor's daughter to read a script no one could understand. But she was unaware the quiet girl held the key to a truth powerful enough to shatter her empire. In a marble hall filled with the world's most brilliant minds, a forgotten language was dismissed as unreadable. The scholars debated, blinded by their own prestige, until one woman smirked and pointed to the girl in the corner. Perhaps our young helper would like to try. What began as a cruel joke would end up exposing a lie buried for decades. Because the girl hiding in the shadows wasn't just observing, she was remembering. Every symbol on that ancient tablet was a whisper from her family's past. A secret her grandfather, a forgotten linguist, had died to protect. And what started as a test to humiliate a child became a revelation that would humble the most powerful woman in the room. This is the story of how a lost lullaby and a little girl's courage finally gave voice to a stolen legacy. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments what your favorite language is. We love seeing the diversity in our community. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. Now, let's get back to the story. An ancient language was thought to be dead, but its secrets were alive in the one person no one thought to ask. A legacy waiting for a voice. The Valerian Grand Conference Hall was a galaxy of intellect and ambition. It glittered with chandeliers that dripped light like frozen waterfalls and hummed with the self-assured chatter of the world's linguistic elite. Voices flowed in a dozen languages, discussing archaic syntax and semantic theory over champagne. The air itself felt heavy, scented with expensive perfume, aged paper, and the metallic tang of unspoken rivalries. It was a world built on the power of the word, where a perfectly turned phrase was worth more than gold. Have you ever been in a place where you felt you didn't belong, where the very air seemed to vibrate on a frequency you couldn't match? 13-year-old Saren Adissa moved through this world like a phantom. A small, still point in a simple blue pinafore, she followed her mother, Irene, who pushed a janitorial cart with a quiet dignity that made her invisible. The squeak of its wheels was the only sound they were permitted to make. It was the role they were assigned. "Keep your head down, Saren," her mother had whispered hours ago, her voice tight. "We are here to clean, not to be seen." Saren understood. In this room, they were background noise, functional and silent. To be noticed was to fail. Yet, Saren couldn't stop listening. Her mind, a natural cartographer of sounds, mapped the conversations around her. She traced the melodic curves of Parisian French, the rhythmic cadence of Yoruba, and the sharp angles of German. To her, it was a living ecosystem of words, and she absorbed its patterns like oxygen. She didn't just hear languages, she felt their shapes and colors. French was a swirling watercolor, Russian a series of polished stones, and Mandarin a flight of intricate kites. It was a secret symphony only she could hear, a private richness in a world that saw her as empty. Balancing a stack of fresh towels, she passed a crowd gathered before a massive holographic display. The keynote address was moments away, and a palpable tension filled the air. At the center of the group stood Dr. Evelyn Armand, a woman forged from ivory and influence. A polyglot millionaire whose name was a brand, she radiated a polished, unshakable control. She wore a cream-colored silk suit that seemed to repel the shadows, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, elegant knot. Her voice, a low and musical instrument, cut through the ambient noise with effortless authority. She gestured at the image on the screen, a tablet covered in elegant, alien symbols. "It is, to put it simply, unreadable," a junior scholar conceded, adjusting his spectacles. "The syntax has no known precedent. The symbols resist every decryption model we have." His tone was one of defeat, an offering to Dr. Armand's superior intellect. Dr. Armand offered a thin, dismissive smile. It didn't quite reach her eyes, which were sharp and analytical, like a hawk's. "Nonsense. Every code has a root. You're simply not looking with the right eyes. It is an extinct branch of a coastal dialect, a linguistic dead end." She spoke with absolute certainty, as if her opinion was historical fact, a monument she had just erected. The scholars around her nodded, their own theories dissolving in the acid of her confidence. Saren froze, her eyes locked on the screen. The symbols weren't alien to her. They were as familiar as her own reflection. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a frantic drum against her ribs. The swirling lines and sharp dots felt like old friends. She could almost hear the melody they formed, a gentle lullaby from the back of her mind. It was the language of her grandfather's hands, the secret songs he used to carve into scraps of driftwood on quiet evenings. He had called them the songs of the wind. A memory surfaced, so vivid it stole her breath. The scent of salt and sawdust in his small workshop, the patient scrape of his knife against the wood, his low voice humming a tune that matched the shapes he carved. "They don't speak to the eyes, Saren," he had told her, his knuckles rough against her cheek. "They sing to the bones." He was gone now, a ghost of a man the world had labeled a failure, but his songs remained, etched not just on wood, but on her soul. "Saren, what are you doing?" Her mother's voice was a sharp, terrified whisper from behind her. Irene hurried to her side, her face pale with panic, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of her cart. "You're staring. Head down. Now." Saren tore her gaze away, her face burning with shame. She had broken the first rule. She had been seen. She could feel the weight of Dr. Armand's gaze land on her, a brief, curious flicker before dismissing her as part of the scenery. But the image of the symbols was now burned into her mind. As the keynote began, Irene guided them to a forgotten corner behind a marble pillar, a pocket of shadow where they could work unnoticed. From there, Saren watched Dr. Armand take the stage. The Millionaire was a masterful performer. She spoke of the Lyran Codex with a storyteller's flair, painting a picture of a lost civilization, a silent people, and a code that had baffled the greatest minds for a generation. "This," Dr. Armand announced, her voice resonating through the hall, "is more than a puzzle. It is the final resting place of a dead language. A tongue that has no children, no echoes, no legacy." She paused for dramatic effect. "My team and I have spent 5 years and millions of dollars attempting to give it a voice. But it remains stubbornly silent." The crowd was captivated, hanging on her every word. But Saren felt a quiet protest rise in her throat. "It's not silent," she thought, clutching a cleaning rag so tightly her fingers ached. "You're just not listening correctly." As Dr. Armand continued, Saren took a risk. Shielded by the pillar, she pulled a crumpled cleaning invoice and a stub of a pencil from her pocket. Her hand shaking, she began to sketch the symbols from memory. The curves flowed from her pencil like water, the dots landing with perfect placement. They weren't just shapes to her, they were notes in a melody. A song about the sky teaching the earth to breathe. A lullaby. Her absorption was so complete that she didn't notice the keynote had ended. She didn't see the polite applause, or the scholars rising to mingle. She only looked up when a shadow fell over her. Dr. Evelyn Armand stood there, a champagne flute held delicately in her hand. Her smile was a perfect, predatory curve. She had been making her way through the crowd, accepting praise, when she'd spotted the janitor's daughter, hunched in the corner, scribbling. "Lost, little one?" Dr. Armand asked, her voice dripping with condescension. Irene froze, her entire body rigid with fear. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. She will not disturb anyone." But Dr. Armand's gaze was fixed on the smudged invoice in Saren's hand. She leaned in, her expensive perfume enveloping Saren in a suffocating cloud. She saw the crudely drawn symbols, the very ones from the Lyran Codex. A flicker of amusement crossed her face, followed by a glint of something sharper. An idea. A way to cap off her evening with a final entertaining flourish of power. What would you have done in that moment, faced with the architect of your own humiliation? She straightened up and tapped her glass for attention. The chatter in the hall slowly died down as heads turned toward her. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Armand announced, her voice carrying a theatrical charm, "it appears we have an aspiring linguist in our midst." She gestured toward Saren. 100 pairs of eyes, belonging to the most respected minds in the world, swiveled to the corner. They fell upon the small girl in the janitor's uniform, who now looked like a frightened animal caught in a hunter's light. "While our best experts have failed," Dr. Armand continued, her smile widening as a ripple of laughter went through the room, "perhaps our young helper here would like to try?" The humiliation was complete. It was a joke, and Saren was the punchline. Irene looked like she might faint, her hand flying to her mouth. But as the laughter washed over her, something shifted inside Saren. The fear was still there, cold and sharp, but underneath it, a different feeling ignited, a fierce protective loyalty to the man who had taught her the songs. To the grandfather whose legacy was being called a dead end. Her gaze lifted from the floor and met Dr. Armand's. In that moment, the question hanging in the air wasn't whether she would speak. It was whether they were ready to hear what she had to say. Courage is not the absence of fear. Sometimes, It's just the quiet, stubborn refusal to let fear have the last word. For 13-year-old Serenadissa, standing in the crosshairs of 100 brilliant minds, fear was a physical thing. It was a cold weight in her stomach, a frantic bird beating against her ribs. The polite, cruel laughter of the audience felt like 1,000 tiny cuts. What would you have done? Would you have run, or would you have found a reason to stand your ground? Dr. Evelyn Armand watched her, a predator enjoying the paralysis of her prey. The entertainment was just beginning. Go on, she urged, her voice a silken command that brooked no argument. She gestured to the grand stage, where the holographic image of the Lyran Codex still floated, a silent testament to her own supposed genius. The stage is yours. Enlighten us. It wasn't a request. It was a sentence. A public execution of a child's dignity for the amusement of the powerful. Irene, her mother, made a small choked sound, a half-step forward before freezing again, trapped between the instinct to protect her daughter and the terror of losing her job. Her face was a mask of pleading anguish. Don't do it, Saren. Please, just stay small. But Saren was no longer looking at her mother. She was looking at the memory of her grandfather's hands, calloused and kind, carving the songs of the wind into a piece of driftwood. She heard his voice, a low and patient rumble, telling her that some things are too important to stay silent for. Words belong to everyone, Saren. Especially the ones the world has forgotten. The laughter in the room faded. The weight of 100 stares lessened. There was only the stage, the symbols, and a promise she had made to a ghost. Taking a breath that felt like drawing shards of glass into her lungs, Saren took a step forward. And then another. Her worn-out shoes, the ones with the frayed laces, made no sound on the polished marble floor. The silence in the hall was now absolute, thick with anticipation. The comedy was about to begin. The janitor's little girl was going to make a fool of herself. Every step she took was a lifetime. She passed tables laden with untouched delicacies, past faces that were a blur of condescending smiles and curious smirks. She could feel their judgment, a physical pressure against her skin. She kept her eyes fixed on the glowing script ahead, a beacon in a sea of ridicule. When she finally reached the stage, the light was blinding. It bleached all the color from the world, leaving only the stark black of the stage and the ethereal glow of the symbols. She felt impossibly small, a tiny rowboat cast into a vast, unblinking ocean. But then her eyes adjusted, and she really looked at the codex. And the world fell away. Up close, the symbols were not just lines and dots. They were alive. They hummed with an energy she recognized, a rhythm she had known her entire life. It was as she had suspected. The scholars had been trying to read a painting. They had been trying to hear a sculpture. They were looking for words, for letters, for rules of grammar that simply didn't apply. Her grandfather had been right. It didn't speak to the eyes. It sang to the bones. The patterns were not syntax, they were melody. The spacing was not punctuation, it was cadence. The clusters of marks were not words, they were chords. It was music notation for the soul. She turned to face the audience, her trembling hands clasped behind her back. She found Dr. Armand's face in the crowd, that perfect, confident smile still in place, waiting for the punchline. Saren took one more deep, shuddering breath and spoke. Her voice was small, barely a whisper, but in the profound silence of the hall, it carried like a bell. "It's not a code," she said softly. "It's a lullaby." The silence that followed was different. The amusement in it had vanished, replaced by a stunned, collective confusion. A few people exchanged baffled looks. Dr. Armand's smile tightened at the edges. What was this nonsense? What game was the child playing? But what happened next shocked everyone. Saren turned back to the glowing script, her posture straightening. The fear was still there, but it was now a current she could ride instead of a wave that would drown her. She lifted a hand, not quite touching the hologram, and traced the first line of symbols. And then, she began to read. Or rather, she began to sing. Her voice, hesitant at first, found its strength. It was a lilting melodic tone, an ancient and haunting tune that filled the cavernous hall. The sounds she made were not from any known language. They were a series of soft vowels and resonant, humming consonants that rose and fell with a perfect, heartbreaking rhythm. And as she sang the sounds, she spoke their meaning in English, her voice weaving a translation over the melody. When the earth lost its breath, she sang, her voice growing steady and clear, The sky taught it to sing again. The hall forgot to breathe. The cadence of her reading was hypnotizing, impossibly right. A data specialist in the front row, who had been live-streaming the joke for his colleagues, now stared at his laptop, his jaw slack. On his screen, a vocal symmetry program was mapping Saren's recitation. The rhythmic patterns she was producing were a perfect mirror of the symbol's mathematical spacing. It wasn't random. It wasn't a guess. It was a flawless one-to-one translation of visual pattern into phonetic sound. When the mountain forgot its name, Saren continued, her eyes half closed as if in a trance, the wind whispered it back to the stone. A professor in the third row let out a strangled gasp. Another scholar slowly lowered himself into his chair, his face ashen. This wasn't a child's fantasy. The linguistic structure she was revealing, the use of tonal pairs to define meaning, it was a theoretical model for proto-languages that had been debated for centuries but never proven. And it fit. It fit perfectly with the known migration patterns of the Lyran coast civilization. This would change everything. Irene Odissa stood by her cart, tears streaming silently down her face. They were tears of pure, unadulterated terror, and a fierce, brilliant pride so overwhelming it threatened to buckle her knees. Her daughter, her quiet, invisible Saren, was performing a miracle. And miracles, Irene knew, were dangerous. Saren finished the final line, her voice echoing in the stunned silence. When memory sleeps beneath the dust, the smallest voice will wake it. She lowered her hand. The lullaby was over. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum where the laughter had been. It was broken by a single sharp sound, the crack of a champagne flute shattering on the marble floor, dropped from a nerveless hand. Dr. Evelyn Armand stared at the stage, her face a pale, rigid mask. The smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp disbelief. This was impossible. It was a trick. It had to be a trick. She forced a laugh, but it came out as a brittle, ugly sound, like breaking glass. "Adorable," she said, her voice strained. What a truly adorable intuition. But no one was listening to her. They were all looking at Saren. The joke was over. And the punchline, it seemed, was on them. Tell us in the comments, guilty or not guilty? Was Dr. Armand's ambition a crime, or just the way the world works? The spell was broken by a voice from the back of the room. It was a man's voice, calm and authoritative. Don't stop her. Heads turned. An older man was making his way down the aisle. He had a shock of white hair and a face carved with a kind of deep lines that come from a lifetime of thoughtful inquiry. It was Professor Danton Meyer, one of the most respected and feared historical linguists in the world. He was known for his brutal honesty and his intolerance for academic vanity. He walked with a slight limp, leaning on a simple wooden cane, but his eyes were sharp and missed nothing. He stopped at the foot of the stage and looked up at Saren, not with pity or amusement, but with a profound scholarly respect. "Child," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Please continue." Dr. Armand stepped forward. "Danton, this is hardly the time for children's games." "This is no game, Evelyn," Meyer cut her off, his gaze not leaving Saren. He turned to the data specialist in the front row. "Send me the audio log and your pattern analysis. Now." He looked back at the crowd, his voice rising to fill the hall. "Are you all blind? Are you not hearing this? She is not guessing. She is interpreting phonemes using a tonal system that aligns perfectly with known coastal runic metrics. Metrics my own team has spent a decade trying to crack." He looked back at Saren, his expression one of pure, unadulterated wonder. "My dear," he said, his voice softer now. "Where in the world did you learn to do that?" The murmurs started then. A low, electric hum that spread through the room like wildfire. Whispers of impossible and revolutionary. The scholars were no longer looking at the janitor's daughter. They were looking at a prodigy. A key. An answer to a question they had long given up on. Dr. Armand stood frozen, her face unreadable. The narrative of the evening, her narrative, had been stolen from her. The unreadable language had been read. The dead tongue had spoken. And it had been given a voice by the one person in the room she had considered less than human. The janitor's child had cracked what the world's most brilliant minds could not. The joke had ended. And in its place, a legend was beginning to stir. A moment of truth is like a crack in a dam. At first, it's a trickle, a whisper of change. Then the pressure builds, the crack splinters, and suddenly the old world is washed away in a flood. In the Valerian Grand Conference Hall, the dam of Dr. Evelyn Armand's perfectly constructed reality had just been breached by the voice of a 13-year-old girl. The air, once thick with polite applause, was now electric with chaos. Scholars scrambled from their seats, shouting over one another, their academic composure shattered. Journalists, smelling blood in the water, pushed against the velvet ropes, their camera flashes turning the scene into a strobing, frantic nightmare. In the center of it all, Saren stood on the stage, a small, motionless island in a turbulent sea. Before Dr. Armand could regain control, Professor Meyer was there. He moved with a speed that defied his age and his limp, placing a protective hand on Saren's shoulder. "Security," he barked. "Get them to the Isadora chamber. Now. No one gets in or out without my permission." 2 guards materialized, creating a buffer as Meyer guided Saren and a shell-shocked Irene off the stage. They were swept through a side door and down a quiet, carpeted hallway, the roar of the conference fading behind them like a distant storm. Dr. Armand followed, her face a mask of cold fury, her earlier poise replaced by a brittle, dangerous energy. The door to the Isadora chamber clicked shut behind them, sealing them in an opulent, suffocating silence. The chamber was a cage of gold leaf and mahogany. A single crystal decanter of water sat on a polished table, untouched. Outside, the faint, rhythmic shouting of reporters could be heard. "Let us in." "Is it true?" "Who is the girl?" The pressure was building. Have you ever been in a room where the silence was louder than the noise? Dr. Armand began to pace, her silk suit whispering with each agitated step. "This is a circus," she hissed, rounding on Saren. "A prank. You memorized a few lines, a few sounds. Who put you up to this? Was it Thorne? Did he pay you?" "Ma'am, please," Irene whispered, her hands twisting the fabric of her uniform. She didn't mean any harm. Harm. Armand let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Your daughter just jeopardized decades of research with a nursery rhyme." It was not a prank. Professor Meyer's voice was low and steady. He had settled into an armchair, his gaze fixed on Saren with an unnerving intensity. He ignored Armand completely. "Young lady," he said, his tone gentle. "You called it a lullaby. You spoke of its melody. Tell me why." Saren flinched under the weight of their attention, but Meyer's expression wasn't hostile. It was deeply, genuinely curious. She looked at her hands, then back at the old professor. "Because the shapes tell you how to sing it," she said, her voice barely audible. "Some are meant to be held long, like a low note. Others are short, like a breath. My grandfather, he taught me." Dr. Armand stopped pacing. A new, sharper fear flickered in her eyes. "Your grandfather?" "He was a carver," Saren said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "He loved stories. He used to say that every sound has a soul, and that the symbols were how you let the soul out." She looked directly at Dr. Armand. "He drew them for me all the time. He said they were songs to help people remember things they'd forgotten." Professor Meyer leaned forward, his old eyes gleaming with an electrifying thought. "Saren," he said, his voice careful. "What was your grandfather's name?" "Elias," she said simply. "Elias Adissa." The name hung in the air. Irene drew a sharp breath. Dr. Armand went utterly still, the color draining from her face. For a fraction of a second, her mask of control disintegrated, revealing a flash of pure, primal panic. It was a look of recognition. A look of guilt. She recovered instantly, but Meyer had seen it. He knew. At that exact moment, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, a message from his research assistant. He read it, then read it again. A slow, grim understanding dawned on his face. "Incredible," he murmured, looking from his phone to Dr. Armand. "While we've been in here, my team has been cross-referencing Saren's recitation with digital fragments of the Lyran Coast excavation, fragments you deemed inconclusive, Evelyn." He stood up, his presence seeming to fill the room. "They are not inconclusive. They fit. Every tonal marker, every phonetic rule she demonstrated, it fits perfectly. She didn't just read a few lines. She has given us the key to the entire language." The air crackled with tension. But the truth had other plans. It wasn't done yet. Saren, wanting to prove she was telling the truth about her grandfather, had been tracing the symbols in her mind, replaying the song. As she did, something new snagged her attention. A pattern she had missed on stage. "Wait," she whispered, looking at Meyer. "There's more." "What is it?" he asked, his focus entirely on her. "The first symbol of each line," she said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "They're different. They stand out." She traced them in the air. An elegant curve. A sharp, angular line. "It looks like an E. And an A. E-A. Evelyn Armand. Doctor." Armand let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. "Oh, for heaven's sake, this is absurd. An acrostic? You're seeing patterns in the clouds. It is a meaningless coincidence." "Is it?" Meyer's voice was dangerously quiet. He was typing furiously on his phone. "Because my assistant is in the digital archives right now. The original field linguist on the Lyran Coast expedition 40 years ago, the man who first discovered the Codex tablet before his funding was mysteriously cut and his work was absorbed by a larger foundation." He looked up, his eyes locking onto Armand's like a judge passing sentence. "His name was Elias Edissa." The silence that followed was a physical blow. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, ugly and undeniable. Elias Edissa hadn't just known the language, he was its discoverer. And his work, his legacy, had been buried and claimed by the very woman standing in this room. The initials weren't a coincidence. They were a signature. Suddenly, a frantic knocking rattled the chamber door. An aide burst in, his face pale and sweating. "Doctor." "Armand," he stammered, ignoring everyone else. "It's a catastrophe. The news has leaked. Someone from the data team. They streamed everything. The reading, the professor's validation, all of it. The board is calling. Vanguard Holdings just pulled their sponsorship." The implosion had begun. Doctor. Armand's empire, built on a foundation of stolen words, was beginning to crumble. The reporters outside were no longer just shouting, they were chanting. "Elias Edissa. Elias Edissa." The noise, the accusations, the crushing weight of the truth, it was too much. Saren covered her ears, her whole body trembling. The wonder of the language, the memory of her grandfather, it was all being twisted into something ugly and frightening. Tears welled in her eyes. "Mama," she cried, turning and burying her face in Irene's uniform. "I want to go home. Please, can we just go home?" Irene wrapped her arms around her daughter, shooting a look of pure hatred at the woman who had caused this. Professor Meyer nodded grimly and began making arrangements for a secure exit. The fight was far from over, but for now, the child at its center needed safety. Doctor. Armand watched them, her face a blank canvas of shock. Her legacy was in flames. Her name was becoming a synonym for fraud. She saw the girl, crying in her mother's arms, not as a victim, but as the saboteur who had lit the match. As the guards escorted Saren and Irene out a back exit, away from the ravenous press, Doctor. Armand stood alone in the gilded cage of the Isadora chamber. The noise outside was a roar, the sound of her world ending. She picked up the crystal decanter and hurled it against the wall, where it exploded in a shower of glittering shards. Her voice, when she spoke to the empty room, was no longer the confident purr of a celebrated intellectual. It was the low, venomous whisper of a queen whose throne was collapsing beneath her. "I built an empire on this," she vowed to the ghosts of her ambition. "I will not lose it to a child." The world outside their small apartment had become a raging bonfire of speculation and scandal, but inside, there was only the quiet scent of old paper and dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. The frantic chaos of the Valerian Hall felt a lifetime away. Here, in their humble living room, history was not a weapon nor a headline. It was a ghost, waiting patiently to be heard. Saren was not interested in the television, where her own face was now plastered across every news channel, a grainy photo of a frightened girl caught in the flashbulb's glare. She ignored the incessant buzzing of her mother's phone, a chorus of ringing from journalists, television producers, and university deans offering full scholarships. None of that felt real. What felt real was the heavy wooden chest that Irene had pulled from the back of a closet, a chest Saren hadn't seen opened in years. Inside lay the entire world of Elias Edissa. It was a treasure trove of a forgotten life. Dozens of worn leather-bound notebooks were stacked neatly, their pages filled with his elegant, sloping script. He wrote in a dizzying array of languages: English, Yoruba, French, Russian, even languages Saren didn't recognize, their characters like beautiful, complex insects. The notebooks weren't just filled with words, they were alive with sketches. There were detailed drawings of coastal rock formations, intricate diagrams of phonetic mouth shapes, and page after page of the Lyran symbols, each one annotated with musical notations and lyrical, handwritten notes. One entry, written in the margins next to a drawing of the symbol for sky, read simply, "This one does not speak. It breathes." Saren ran her fingers over the brittle pages, a profound sense of connection washing over her. She was not just looking at research, she was touching her grandfather's soul. Tucked into the final notebook was a sealed, yellowed envelope. On the front, in his familiar hand, were 2 words, "For future ears." As Saren read through the notebooks, Irene watched her, her face a roadmap of old grief. She finally broke the silence, her voice soft and heavy with memory. "He was a brilliant man," she began, sinking onto the worn sofa. "The most brilliant man I ever knew. But the world does not like a brilliance it cannot own." She told Saren the story. The real story. Elias Adissa had been the lead field linguist for a small independent research team funded by a university. He had been the one to unearth the Lyran Codex on a remote coastal dig. It was the discovery of a lifetime. He poured his heart into its translation, recognizing its musical nature almost immediately. But his project was small, underfunded, and drew the attention of a much larger, more powerful foundation, the one run by Dr. Armand's mentor. They offered to partner with him, Irene said, her eyes distant. They called it a collaboration. What they wanted was his data. Her voice grew tight with a decades-old anger. "Your grandfather was trusting. He shared everything, his notes, his theories, his early translations. And when he realized they were planning to publish his work under their own name, he accused them of theft." The Foundation's response was swift and brutal. They used their influence to discredit him. They painted him as an eccentric, an unstable obsessive who was making fantastical claims. His university, buckling under pressure from the powerful Foundation, dismissed him. His funding vanished overnight. His reputation was systematically destroyed. "He died a few years later," Irene whispered, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Everyone said it was from a broken heart. They called him a failure, a fraud. But he never stopped believing in the songs of the wind. He ran out of time to make the world listen." The story settled in the room, heavy and suffocating. The injustice of it burned in Saren's chest. The scholarships, the interviews, the sudden fame, it all felt like a bitter insult to his memory. What do you do when the world that destroyed your family suddenly wants to celebrate you? Comment below what choice you would have made in her shoes. "They want to put me on television," Saren said quietly, looking up from the notebooks. "They want to give me awards." Irene's face hardened. "They want to own you, Saren. Just like they tried to own him. They will turn you into a story, a headline for a week, and then they will forget you. We can't let that happen." "I don't want their awards," Saren said, her voice trembling with a new steel-edged resolve. "I want his name back." That evening, a secure video call was arranged. Professor Danton Meyer's face appeared on Saren's small laptop screen, his study lined with thousands of books. He looked tired but energized, a warrior on the verge of a great battle. "Saren," he said, his voice warm, "the world is in an uproar. You've done more to advance historical linguistics in one night than most scholars do in a lifetime." "I just read my grandfather's song," she replied humbly. "It is far more than a song," Meyer said, his expression turning serious. "I've been studying the transcription of your reading. There's a layer we all missed. The lullaby itself is a map." He shared his screen, displaying the translated text. He had highlighted certain words: mountain, sky, stone, dust. These words correspond to the phonetic names of known geographical landmarks along the Lyran coast, he explained. "It's a set of directions. A message." Saren's eyes widened as she followed his logic. She looked down at the poem, reciting the final lines from memory. "When memory sleeps beneath the dust, the smallest voice will wake it." "It's a message to someone," she breathed. "To the keepers of the first voice." "Precisely," Meyer confirmed, his excitement palpable. Elias wasn't just translating a poem. He was preserving a path. He believed this codex was only one half of a whole. This lullaby, it's a map to a second tablet. The revelation was a seismic shock. This was no longer just about correcting a historical injustice. It was about finishing her grandfather's quest. It was about unearthing a history so old, it had been forgotten by the world. It was a legacy waiting to be claimed. Dr. Armand knows none of this, Meyer continued, his tone shifting to one of strategy. Right now, she is in full denial. Her lawyers are issuing statements calling you an impressionable child, and this a coordinated hoax. She is trying to ride out the storm. We have to tell them, Saren insisted. We have to show them grandfather's notebooks. And we will, Meyer agreed. But we will do it on our terms. The World Polyglot Summit has been officially reinstated under the university's direct control. They have invited you to be the keynote speaker. It's in 2 days. The turning point had arrived. It was a choice, a moral crossroads. They could leak the notebooks to the press, feeding the bonfire of scandal. Or they could stand on the world stage, in the very room where she was humiliated, and present the undeniable academic proof. They could give Elias Edissa his name back with dignity, not with gossip. We will make a joint announcement, Professor Meyer declared, his voice firm. You will perform the full translation of the lullaby. I will present the linguistic proof and the evidence from your grandfather's archives that confirms his authorship. We will reveal both the meaning of the codex and the injustice that has hidden it for 40 years. The plan was set. The stage was being prepared for a final confrontation. In 2 days, the truth would be laid bare for the entire world to see. And in her penthouse suite, surrounded by lawyers and public relations experts, Dr. Evelyn Armand, cornered and desperate, would have to make a choice. Would she double down on her lies and face total annihilation, or would she finally confront the ghost of the man she had erased and seek an impossible redemption? The world was about to hold its breath once more. 2 days later, the Valerian Grand Conference Hall was unrecognizable. The opulent, self-satisfied air was gone, replaced by the stark, buzzing energy of a global media event. Banks of television cameras lined the walls, their red recording lights like 100 unblinking eyes. Every seat was filled not just with scholars, but with journalists, dignitaries, and corporate executives, all of them drawn by the scent of a story that was now bigger than linguistics. It was a story about truth, theft, and the quiet power of a single voice. The world was watching. The summit was broadcast live on every major network. The title on the screen was simple, The Lyran Codex, A Reckoning. Backstage, Saren stood with Professor Meyer and her mother, the quiet hum of the waiting crowd a low thrum beneath their feet. She was no longer wearing her janitor's pinafore. At Professor Meyer's gentle insistence, she wore a simple, dark blue dress. It was a gift from the university, but it felt like a costume for a role she had never asked to play. Are you ready? Meyer asked, his hand resting on her shoulder. Saren looked at her mother, who gave her a small, shaky nod. Irene's eyes were filled with a terror that was now eclipsed by a fierce, brilliant pride. Your grandfather is with you, she whispered. Saren took a deep breath and nodded. She was ready. As Professor Meyer was announced, a sudden stir rippled through the back of the hall. The doors opened, and a figure walked in, causing a fresh volley of camera flashes to erupt. It was Dr. Evelyn Armand. She was not escorted by lawyers or security. She was alone. She wore a simple unadorned black dress, her hair pulled back, her face pale but composed. She wasn't there as a speaker or a guest of honor. She walked with a quiet, dignified air of someone arriving to witness her own sentencing. Ignoring the whispers and the cameras, she found an empty seat in the very last row and sat down, her back perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on the stage. Professor Meyer began, his voice echoing with historical gravity. He did not speak of scandal. He spoke of discovery. He presented the academic case, laying out the irrefutable proof, slides of Elias Edissa's notebooks, the pages filled with sketches of the Lyran symbols, placed side by side with the codex itself. He showed dated, signed letters where Elias described the language's musical structure 40 years ago. He presented the authenticated archaeological records that named Elias Edissa as the sole discoverer. The evidence was a hammer, each piece a blow that systematically dismantled a 40-year-old lie. For decades, Meyer concluded, his voice ringing with righteous anger, we, the academic community, have been complicit in a great silence. We failed to listen. Today, that silence ends. I give you the voice that will wake the memory from the dust. I give you Adissa. As Saren walked onto the stage, a hush fell over the audience. The holographic codex materialized in the air behind her, glowing softly. She looked out at the sea of faces, the bright lights, and found the one face in the back row. For a long moment, the girl who was erased and the woman who erased her held each other's gaze across a silent, cavernous room. Then, Saren turned to the audience and began to speak. "When you look at these symbols," she said, her voice clear and steady, amplified for the world to hear, "you might see a puzzle. A code. But my grandfather saw a conversation." She spoke of the lullaby's true meaning. It wasn't just a map to a hidden place, it was a map of the human heart. It spoke of unity. The unity between silence and sound, between a mountain and the wind that shapes it, between the past and the present. It teaches us that nothing is ever truly lost if we have the courage to listen, she explained. And that the smallest voices often carry the most important songs. It says that knowledge shouldn't be a fortress we build to keep others out. It should be a bridge we build to let others in. Then, she closed her eyes and began to sing. The lullaby filled the hall, a sound so pure and ancient it seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the building. It was the same melody she had sung 2 nights before, but now it was imbued with a new power, the power of truth. It was a song of mourning for what was lost and a song of hope for what could be found. It was her grandfather's voice, flowing through her, finally being heard. When she finished, there was no applause. There was only a profound, reverent silence. History had been corrected. A legacy had been reclaimed. The world had witnessed it, live and in real time. Later, in the quiet pandemonium backstage, Saren found herself in a small private waiting room. The door opened, and Dr. Armand stepped inside, closing it gently behind her. The two of them were alone for the first time since the confrontation in the Isadora chamber. The arrogance was gone from Armand's face, replaced by a weary, hollowed-out humanity. She looked smaller, older. "I had a choice 40 years ago," she began, her voice low and devoid of its usual theatrics. "I was a young researcher, ambitious. My mentor was a powerful man, and the Foundation's investors were demanding results. Elias Adissa was a genius, but he was inconvenient. My mentor told me that his work was too esoteric, too poetic to be taken seriously. He said the world needed a stronger name to champion the discovery. My name." She finally met Saren's eyes, and for the first time, Saren saw not a monster, but a person who had made a terrible choice and had been living with the ghost of it ever since. "He was right about one thing," Armand continued. "The world didn't listen to Elias. But they listened to me. I built an empire on his silence. It was a Faustian bargain, and today, the bill came due." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "What you did on that stage, you didn't just give him his name back. You gave back the dignity I allowed them to steal. There is nothing I can do to erase my part in that. But I am asking you, let me help. Let me fund your work. An institute in your grandfather's name. A foundation to preserve the world's endangered languages. Everything I have. I want to use it to build the legacy I tried to bury." It was an astonishing offer. A public confession of guilt and an act of penance. What would you do? Can a stolen legacy ever be repaired with the very money it generated? Saren looked at this woman, this architect of her family's pain, and saw the truth of the lullaby reflected in her tired eyes. The unity between past and present. The chance for the sky to teach the earth to sing again. She thought of her grandfather's boundless curiosity, his belief that every sound had a soul worth saving. Vengeance would only create more silence. But preservation, that was a song that could last forever. She gave a small, quiet nod. "Then help me preserve what you tried to own," Saren answered softly. A single tear escaped Armand's eye, a crack in the dam of her composure. It was not the answer she had expected. It was more than forgiveness. It was a purpose. When they stepped out of the room moments later, the applause from the main hall was still going. But as Saren walked into the light to find her mother, the sound no longer felt like a celebration of a victory. It felt like absolution. 6 months later, the world was a different place. Spring sunlight, the color of warm honey, streamed through the tall arched windows of a building that had once been a forgotten university library. Now, it was a place of sound and life. This was the Odessa Institute for Living Languages, a sanctuary built not of brick and mortar, but of reclaimed history and quiet courage. Inside, the main hall was not silent. It was filled with the sound of children's voices, a bright, cascading melody. They weren't reading from books in neat, orderly rows. They were gathered in a circle on the floor around a young woman, their faces upturned and filled with wonder. On a large screen behind them, the elegant symbols of the Lyran script glowed softly. The children were learning to read the ancient language not through memorization, but through music, just as Saren's grandfather had taught her. They sang the phonetic sounds, clapping out the rhythmic patterns, their laughter echoing where scholarly silence once reigned. Watching from the doorway was Irene Odessa. She no longer wore a janitor's uniform. Today she wore a simple but smart navy blue blazer, a small silver nameplate on the lapel that read, Irene Odessa, Head of Facilities. She carried a clipboard, but she wasn't checking off cleaning supplies. She was reviewing the plans for a new West Wing, a wing dedicated to the digital preservation of oral histories. The perpetual fear she had once carried in her shoulders was gone, replaced by a calm, steady pride that radiated from her like warmth. Her gaze fell on her daughter. Saren stood in the center of the circle, no longer a phantom in the shadows, but the quiet, confident heart of this new world. She was teaching a group of visiting dignitaries, showing them how the children were not just learning a language, but connecting with a way of seeing the world that had almost been lost forever. The girl who had once been told to keep her head down, to be invisible, now spent her days raising the voices of others. She was teaching the world to listen. A quiet presence came to stand beside Irene at the doorway. It was Dr. Evelyn Armand. The 6 months since the summit had softened her. The sharp, brittle edges of her ambition had been worn away, leaving behind a woman who was quieter, more thoughtful. The vanity was gone, replaced by a gentle humility. She visited the institute occasionally, never announcing her arrival, content to watch from the sidelines. Her funding, channeled anonymously through a dozen foundations, was the silent engine that made all of this possible. Irene nodded a simple greeting. There was no animosity left between them, only a shared understanding. "They're learning so fast," Irene said, her voice soft with awe. "It's because she isn't teaching them words," Armand replied, her eyes on Saren. "She's teaching them a memory." Their gazes drifted to a simple bronze plaque on the wall near the entrance. It was the only place in the entire institute where Armand's name appeared. It read, "In memory of the first voice, and in hope for all that follow. Elias Odessa and Evelyn Armand, keepers." Later that afternoon, after the last of the students and dignitaries had gone home, Saren stood alone in the great empty hall. The sun was setting, casting long golden shafts of light across the polished floor. The silence that settled was not empty, it was full of peaceful echoes. She thought about the journey, about the impossible turn her life had taken. She finally understood what her grandfather had meant. Languages were not collections of rules and words. They were living things, the collected memories of a people. Every forgotten word was a forgotten dream, a lost story, a silenced ancestor, just waiting for someone brave enough to listen. This story was a reminder that the most important histories are often the quietest. If you feel the same, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a story that gives voice to the forgotten. We'd love to know in the comments, what is a piece of your own family history you believe is worth preserving? Saren closed her eyes and began to hum. The ancient haunting melody of the Lyran lullaby filled the silence, a song of thanks to the grandfather she had vindicated. As the last note faded from her lips, a gentle breeze stirred from an open window, rustling the curtains like a soft, appreciative sigh. It was a whisper. An answer. The songs of the wind, finally at peace. And somewhere beyond sound, the world learned to listen again.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.